Good evening, and welcome to Mining the Riches of the Parsha. Tonight is Thursday night, November 2nd, 2023. The first piece I want to share is related to this week's Torah portion, the Parsha of VaYeira. And it is also another expression of something that I've shared with you before. There is a remarkable Torah scholar and teacher, Rabbi Yosef Rimon in Israel. I've quoted him to you many times before. And what is so special about him is not only his incredible expertise in every area of Jewish learning, and not only his superhuman energy to be able to teach and develop programs and to answer questions hundreds and hundreds every day from all over the world. But all of that is intertwined with an exquisite humanity that just shines forth in everything that he says. So the first piece is something from Rabbi Rimon that I'd like to share with you. And we've said this before, but the closer we analyze the words of the Torah, the more lessons we learn, even about subjects that may seem obvious to us, and that's why we concentrate and delve into every single word. So at the beginning of this week's Torah portion, we see Avraham and Sarah, and we understand that Avraham is the source of the capacity for chesed, for kindness to others. Avraham expresses it in a way that is so complete and so sensitive that even now, 4,000 years later, we are learning by analyzing every single word to extract the many, many lessons that we can learn about how to be kind and sensitive and hospitable to others that we learn from Avraham. Our sages tell us, famous line, we've discussed this before, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Rav, Gedola hachnasas archim mehakbolas pnei shchina. It is a bigger mitzvah to show hospitality to guests who come to your home for hospitality. That is more important than speaking to God. It sounds amazing. Where in the world do we learn such a lesson? We learn the lesson from the beginning of our Torah portion. Diksiv, VaYeira elav Hashem be'lonei mamre. God appeared to Avraham, and then the pasuk says, VaYomer Hashem imna matasichei meinecha al nasavar mi'avdecha. Hashem, please hold on one second. It's very important that you have come to speak to me, God, but I see that there are three strangers walking in the desert. I want to invite them into my house. I want to show them hospitality. So please, could you just wait here a couple of minutes and let me take care of the guests first? So from the fact that Avram said to God, please wait for me so that I can take care of the guests first, we learn from here that showing hospitality to guests is even greater than speaking directly with God. Wow, what an amazing lesson. We've discussed this and different aspects of it in previous years, but that's the lesson. Now, the Rambam, Maimonides, codifies this, and he writes this line. Remember, the Rambam, Maimonides, among others, codifies. So he takes a statement in the Talmud, decides what is normative, what is the correct position, and then he includes it in his major work of Mishnah Torah, his book of Jewish law. This is the law. And the Rambam writes as follows. It is greater to show hospitality to guests than to speak directly to God. Shenemar, because the verse says, Vayar v'hine shlosha anashim. Avraham lifted his eyes and he saw that there were three people walking in the desert. So, the way that we analyze works like the Rambam Maimonides is we analyze every single word, because every word is written with precision. There's a reason that it's there. The Rambam made a choice to use this word and not that word, and every single choice of words has a lesson to teach us. And the question is, the Rambam quotes a verse to support this idea that it's greater to show hospitality to guests than to speak to God. But the Rambam chooses a verse that is different from what the Talmud says. The Talmud says that we derive this lesson, it's greater to show hospitality to guests, when Avraham says to God, please excuse me while I go to see to these guests in the distance. But the Rambam doesn't quote that verse. It's very strange. And this is one of the things that we pay attention to. When the Rambam quotes a verse, we pay attention to which verse does the Rambam quote. And if he doesn't quote the same verse as the Talmud, why? He quotes an earlier verse. He quotes the verse that says, Vayisa einav, Avraham lifted his eyes, Vayar v'hinei shlosha anashim, and he saw that there were three people. Now, at that moment that Avraham saw that there were three people, there was no interruption yet. There was no offer of hospitality yet. This is an earlier verse. So the question is, why does the Rambam, in citing the same rule as the Talmud, not quote the same verse, but a different verse? Rabbi Rimon quotes an answer that comes from Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe. And the answer is as follows. The moment that the chesed begins, hospitality or sharing or whatever the kindness is, the moment that the act of kindness begins is not the moment of the action. It's not the moment of inviting the guest in or cooking the food or serving the food. That's not where it begins. The chesed, an act of kindness, begins with sight, with seeing. Chesed begins when I see a person and recognize that I might be able somehow to help that person. The act of kindness that I do, the actual inviting, the actual serving, the actual cooking, all of those are consequences of the original act. The original act is seeing. And Rabbi Rimon derives from this a very, very important lesson. It's relevant to every single one of us, and it's relevant all the time in all places, in any kind of group situation, in the synagogue, at home, celebrating around the Shabbos table, in any situation where there's a group of people. A person, if you want to try to emulate Avraham, a person has to always be aware of the people around them in order to be sensitive if there is someone who might need some help. It is the awareness, the looking around to see, is there anything that I can do for another person at this moment? That's where kindness begins. Kindness starts with sight. It's a specific kind of sight. It's a sight of love. It's a seeing where I'm trying to see, what can I do to show you that I love you? What can I do to show you that I care about you? I'm looking for the opportunity. I'm not waiting. We discussed this earlier this week. I'm not waiting until the opportunity presents itself to me. Okay, that's also very nice. But the characteristic of Avraham is that it begins with sight. He's looking, he's seeing, he's thinking about what does someone else possibly need. All chesed, all acts of kindness start with seeing. Seeing deeply, noticing before the need is obvious, seeing with love to want to help, looking for the opportunity to be able to help, and also seeing what is most helpful not only now, but long term into the future. Okay, so our Torah portion begins, VaYeira elav Hashem be'elonei Mamre. God appears to Avraham. V'hu yoshe pesach ha'oel kechom hayom. Avraham is sitting in the doorway to his tent in the heat of the day. And God appears to him. Why did God appear to Avraham? Rashi says, levaker es hachole, to visit the sick. What was wrong with Avraham? Why was Avraham sick that he needed a visit from God? Rashi says it was the third day after his bris. Remember, the first commandment of ritual circumcision, of bris milah, was given to Avraham. Avraham performed it on himself and then on his son Yishmael. So he had had a bris. It's painful. And this was the third day after the bris. God came to visit someone who was sick, who was in pain. Why specifically the third day after the bris? Why not the second day? Why not the fourth day? So Rashi, who lived almost 1,000 years ago, 900 years ago, Rashi gives a medical reason. I'm not a doctor, but I think even today we recognize some truth to what Rashi is saying. Rashi says, the third day after an operation is the most painful. So that was the day God chose to visit, because that was the day that Avraham needed cheering up the most. The third day. Okay, that's what Rashi says. Reb Shlomo Carlebach gives a different answer. A deeper answer, not a medical answer, but an emotional answer with, I believe, a powerful lesson for every single one of us. On the first day, you do something holy, something radical, something outrageous. You're energized. You're radiant. You're excited about this amazing, gigantic, new, big thing that you did. On the second day, you're more calm. You're more even. On the third day, you may start to regret what you did. There's a term for this. This is known as buyer's remorse. You ever been to a store, or let's say you buy a car, it's expensive, and you're going between this one and the other one, and finally you decide to buy the car, and you sign the papers, and it's done. You own the car. And then, it's very curious, the salesperson might say to you, boy, that's a beautiful car you got. You made just the right choice. Beautiful, beautiful car. It's kind of strange because you already bought the car. Wouldn't you have thought that the salesperson would try to compliment your choice before he made the sale in order to clinch the sale? But that's a very common thing because it is known in retail and in other areas of life that when a person makes a big decision, often after they make that big decision, they may start to regret it. They may feel remorse. So the time that they need to be reinforced, no, you made a good decision, you made a good choice, is after the excitement of the decision has fallen off. And you may start to think, what have I done? I spent so much money. I don't really like it. It's the wrong color. That's when a person starts to feel buyer's remorse. And it applies in every area of life. When you extend yourself to buy something expensive a little bit more than you can afford. Or, let's just talk about mitzvos. When you make a generous donation that's a little bit beyond what you can really comfortably afford, but you were caught up in the enthusiasm of doing this great mitzvah. Or you may have committed yourself to some involved act of kindness, and then you realize it's going to be more difficult and more time-consuming than you first imagined. Maybe you plan to make a change in your routine, or a plan to change your character, which is a major, major life decision, to take a new direction in life. And then you may think to yourself, what have I done? How am I going to live up to that? I don't know what I was thinking. I don't know if I'm capable of doing that. Now, we see another example of this later in our Torah portion, the narrative of Akedas Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac. God asks Avraham and Yitzchak, let's remember, father and son, and what God asks is so immense, it's so unbelievable that Avraham will offer his son Yitzchak as an offering. It's so overwhelming to receive such a command from God. And Avraham responds immediately, Hineni, here I am, I'm ready, I'm prepared. Right away, no questions. But then the Torah tells us, Vayihi bayom hashlishi, and it was on the third day. Avraham and Yitzchak were traveling to this place. And it was on the third day that they reached that place. The actual event of the binding of Isaac only takes place on the third day after the command. Why the delay? Why not tell Avraham, if you're asking Avraham to offer Yitzchak, why don't you tell him to do it today? Because God understood that Avraham would be overwhelmed by receiving a command from God. He would be energized at the idea, I am willing to have faith in God. I don't understand it, but I am sure it's going to work out. And there would be this energy. And he would have this enthusiasm for this dramatic mission. And he would agree immediately. But as he starts walking, and now it's the next day, and now it's the third day, now Avraham is thinking more calmly and more clearly. And Yitzchak is thinking more calmly and more clearly. That's the real test. Will Avraham still do the impossible that God commanded 3 days earlier? But here's the point. Avraham had already experienced a third day. Our passage, the third day after his bris. And the reason God came to Avraham on the third day after the bris at the beginning of our Torah portion is to bestow on Avraham and through Avraham to his descendants, to you and me, the resolve, the strength to overcome the inevitable challenge of the third day. Every third day, any third day. Any time we may start to question or even to regret a spiritual advance we have put into motion, every one of us has third day moments. In all areas of life. It's normal. And when it happens, when we start to feel regret, when we start to think to ourselves, why did I agree to that? Why did I start this? Remember what God gave Avraham with his visit, and through Avraham gave to each of us the reassurance and the strength of conviction to continue to live up to our highest impulses and to never regret anything that makes us better, that makes us holier. There is something that happens in synagogues it's one of the more prevalent turnoffs, sadly, that cause people not to want to come back to a synagogue. It's unfortunate. And that is a person who comes to shul and they're sitting in their seat, they're davening. And someone comes over to them and says, "You're in my seat. Please move." So I'm begging you, please don't ever do that. Don't ever do that. But the worst part of this is that some people, when they say, "You're sitting in my seat, please move," they will claim to have a righteous reason for doing this because they want to sit in their regular seat, which is known as Makom Kavua. Makom Kavua means my regular place, the place that is set aside for me. And the source of this is in our Torah portion. So in our Parsha, we know that Avraham prayed to God to save the inhabitants of Sodom. And then we learn in the Torah that the Sodom was destroyed. God did not agree with Avraham's request. The area was destroyed. And the next morning, the Torah says, "Vayashkem Avram baboker." Avram got up early in the morning. El hamakom asher omad sham es pnei Hashem, and stood in the same place that he had stood the day before. Vayashkef al pnei Sodom v'Amorah, and he looked out over the plain of Sodom and Amorah. V'al kol pnei Eretz HaKikor, the entire region. Vayar v'hine ola kitor ha'aretz kekitor hakivshon. And he saw that there was smoke rising up from the land like smoke coming out of a furnace. So the Talmud says, the Amidah, when the Torah says Avram stood at the place that he had stood before, so the day before he had stood to pray to God to save the people of Sodom, the next day, Avram came back to the same place, Asher Omad Sham Es Pnei Hashem, the same place that he had stood the day before, and he was going to pray to God again. The Talmud says, Amidah zu tefillah. This standing is prayer. By the way, this is the origin of using the word Amidah for the Shemona Esrei, the prayer that we say while we're standing. Because Avram said this prayer while he was standing, and he was standing in the same place this day as he stood the day before. So you see that there is this idea, Melamed Shavram Avinu Kava Makom L'Tfilah. So the Talmud says this teaches us that Avram had a special designated spot where he would stand to pray to God every day in the same place. Ideally, a person should have a Makom Kavua, a set place for prayer, at home, in shul. And this is where I sit. This is where I stand all the time. Makom Kavua, my set place. And the simple understanding of this is to enhance the gravity of prayer, to enhance the consciousness and awareness, the kavana that we have. There are less distractions. I'm in the same place. There's a certain comfort. There's a certain gravity to dedicating a spot where this is the place that I stand to pray. All right. So Makom Kavua is a good thing. It's a real thing. There's such a thing as Makom Kavua. Okay, so if it's a real thing, isn't it legitimate if I come to shul and somebody is sitting in my seat? Shouldn't I be able to say to them, excuse me, would you please move? This is my Makom Kavua. This is my regular seat. No, you should not do that, and I'll explain why. Listen to the full passage of the Talmud. Amar Rabbi Chelbo. Rabbi Chelbo says, anyone who has a Makom Kavua for their prayer will be assisted by the God of Avraham. And when that person dies, in heaven they will say about him, what a pious individual, what a humble person. He was a disciple of Avraham Avinu, our patriarch Abraham. Amazing. Just because a person davens with a Makom Kavua. So I want to promise you something. If insisting on sitting in your regular seat means you ask someone else to move, I want to promise you, you will not be called by God a humble person and a pious person. And if you allow someone else to feel welcome, even if he or she is in your seat and you sit somewhere else, I promise you, God will call you a humble person and a pious person. And the truth is, even though this is a halacha of Makom Kavua, it would be best if we always consider ourselves to not have a regular seat in shul, because the possibility of causing upset or making someone feel unwelcome is so much more serious than whatever benefit there is to sitting in the same seat all the time. But let's go deeper. I want to share with you an insight that comes from a sefer called Shemen HaTov about a deeper meaning of this concept of Makom Kavua. There's a famous pasuk, we quote it in our prayers. Mi yaleh bahar Hashem, umi yakum bimkom kacho. Who will ascend the mountain of God, and who will stand in God's holy place? Famous pasuk, we read it all the time. This pasuk alludes to two levels of greatness. The first level is Mi yaleh bahar Hashem, who will ascend the mountain of God, meaning who will rise in spirituality and character and morality, who will rise up to that great peak. But the second level is an even greater challenge. Umi yakum bimkom kadsho. And who will be established, who will remain in that high place. It's one thing to reach a peak. It's much more difficult to hold on to it. Many of us may reach a peak of holiness and closeness to God at the moment that Yom Kippur ends, when the shofar blows at the end of Ne'ilah. It's much more difficult to hold on to that, to stay there. That's much more difficult. Because invariably in life, inevitably in life, in our spiritual lives, there is waxing and waning. We go up and we go down. Things happen to us. We have disappointments. We have setbacks. We become discouraged. And we fall down sometimes in our levels. So That's what the verse is telling us. Mim yaleh b'har Hashem. It's a beautiful thing to be able to achieve, to rise to a moment of greatness, but it's even more difficult, a greater challenge, umi yakum kim kon shkacho, to be able to stay there, to remain there. Listen carefully. The Shemin HaTov explains that Makom Kavua, a set place, does not only mean where you stand or sit in the same spot every day. Makom Kavua means you approach prayer with the same enthusiasm every day, with the same faith every day, with the same certainty that you're speaking directly to God every day. That's what it means. It would have been natural for Avraham, after he had prayed for the people of Sodom, and then the next day he looks out and he sees that his prayers were in vain and everything is destroyed. It would have been understandable for Avraham to have been discouraged and disappointed and to say to himself, my prayer didn't do anything. What's the use of prayer? Why should I pray again? It would be very understandable at that point to give up hope and to feel that prayer is worthless. The greatness of Avraham is that he established a Makom Kavua for his prayer. In other words, on the day that he was rejected more than any other day in his life, the next day he went back to the same place and he prayed the same prayer with the same faith, with the same love, with the same optimism, with the same concentration. There was no spiritual descent in Avraham's prayers. That's the true meaning, that a person who establishes a Makom Kavua for their prayer, the God of Avraham will bless that person. Doesn't just mean sitting in the same seat. It means despite setbacks and disappointments that we invariably face in life, that we're still able to stay steadfast in our belief and faith in God and constant in our devotion to God. Such a person is a true disciple of Avraham. And I want to show you this now in contrast to Noach. You remember a couple of weeks ago when we learned about Noah? The Torah Parsha began, Noach ish tzadik tamim haya b'dorosav. Noach, the Torah says, this is God writing, Noach was a righteous man, pure in his generation. Wow. I mean, whatever else happens, that's for all time. When God himself says about a person that person's ish tzadik, I mean, you could take that to the bank. That's it. That's for all time. That's amazing. We don't see anything like that when Avraham is introduced to us. We don't see any title. We don't see any adjective. We don't see any hint of greatness. God just simply says to Avraham, Lech lecha mi'artzecha. I want you to go. I want you to go somewhere. There's nothing in the Torah that indicates to us that Avraham is anything special. So let's now analyze and think about and contrast Noach and Avraham, because in one sense, they both faced a very similar challenge. And they responded to this challenge very differently. And it is in the response to this challenge that the one who started out great did not end up great, Noach, and the one who started out plain ended up changing the course of history and leaving a legacy that the majority of the entire world today respects Avraham. And that experience they both faced, and to which they responded so differently, was profound disappointment. And this is something that every one of us in our lives we face. And how we respond when something like this happens to us says more about us than just about anything else. Noach saw the destruction of his world. Notwithstanding all of the years of building an ark and presumably warning others of their fate unless they change their behavior, Noach did not manage to save anyone except himself and his family. I don't think any one of us can imagine what it must have felt like to Noach to leave the ark. The disappointment, the despair, to see an uninhabited, desolate world. What did Noach do next? The Torah says, Vayechal Noach ish ha'adama. Noach became a farmer. Now that makes sense. The whole world is desolate. You got to start over again. Start with farming. Start with growing crops. That makes sense. But here is where our rabbis find fault with Noach. Because of the next two words. Because the next two words in the verse introduce the last scene we know of Noach's life. Even though Noach lived another 350 years after this, the last thing we know about Noach, the legacy that Noach leaves for all time, is in the next two words. Remember, there is no other narrative in the Torah about him. Vayechal Noach ish ha'adama. Noach became a farmer. Next two words, Vayita kerem. And he planted a vineyard. He planted a vineyard. He became drunk from the wine that he produced. He humiliated himself in front of his children, his family, and in front of the eyes of every person who has read the Torah up until and including today and going into the future. Believe me when I tell you that I can understand Noach coming out of the ark and wanting a good bottle of wine, or three. But that's all Noach does. He is not able to recover from that disappointment. It's understandable. I will say in all honesty, I don't think I would have acted any better. I probably would have acted worse. And the Torah does not criticize Noach. The Torah does not say he was wrong or he was bad. But this is where Noach loses his reach to greatness. There's a comparable challenge in Avraham's life, not exactly the same, but roughly comparable in our Torah portion. Fighting with God, arguing with God to save the people of Sodom. It's not the same. In some ways it was less difficult because it's not the entire world that was destroyed, it's only a certain region. In some ways, the challenge that Avraham faced was worse than what Noach faced, because Avraham was not only trying to save the lives of the people in Sodom, Avraham was also trying to save his image of God as just. Remember, Avraham says to God, "Hashofet kol haaretz lo yashem mishpat." The judge of all the earth will not judge justly. Avraham couldn't believe that God would decide to kill all of the inhabitants of Sodom. And it appeared to Avraham that the challenge, the charge that Avraham issues is that God is not judging justly. And he fails. Vayashkem Avram baboker. And Avraham got up early in the morning. El hamakom asher omad sham es pnei Hashem. He stood in the same place that he had stood the day before when he was praying to save the people of Sodom. But now, Vayashkef al pnei Sodom v'Amora, he looks out over the plain. Vayar v'hine ola kitar ha'aretz kekitar ha'kivshan. He sees that it's all destroyed. The smoke is rising up like the smoke from a furnace. He failed. He failed to save the people of Sodom. He failed to be able to understand God as a just judge. He failed. I don't think any one of us can imagine what Avraham felt seeing the smoke of destruction of Sodom. And here our rabbis offer an insight and describe how Avraham reacted to the most profound disappointment in his life, a reaction that sets him on a path different from Noach, on a path to greatness. The Siporno says, one of our classic commentators, Siporno, why did Avraham stand there to pray the next day? It was over. God said no. It was destroyed. Why was he standing to pray the next day? The Siporno says, Choshav levakesh aleim rachamim. Avram said to himself, maybe there are survivors. Maybe there are survivors, and I can pray to God for mercy for the survivors. Amazing. Avram argued with God. He pleaded before God. He lost. He lost to God. But he did not accept that because he lost, he should stop fighting for what he believed was right. He lost, but he was not discouraged. Not discouraged to continue his effort. He came and prayed again. Now, I don't know. Maybe the night before he too had a bottle of wine. But the next morning, Vayashkem Avram baboker, Avram got up early in the morning, El Makom asher omad sham es pnei Hashem, and he stood in the same place that he had stood the day before, and he prayed to God with the same enthusiasm, with the same energy, with the same pleading that he had prayed the day before. Even though the day before God had clearly said no, Avram didn't quit. Avram didn't give up. Avram continued to fight for what he believed in. And he continued to do that for the rest of his life. That is Makom Kavua. That's making your prayer not only reaching one time a high place, but remaining, even in the face of failure and disappointment, remaining constant in our service to God. There's a quote. It always touches me. If you know a bit about American political history, one of the most interesting characters in modern American political history, in my opinion, a lot of people's opinion, is Richard Nixon, President of the United States, best known for losing the office, resigning after Watergate. But the truth is, Richard Nixon was an amazing person. He was incredibly smart. And he had a very long political career. In fact, in the 1960s, after he lost the presidency to John F. Kennedy, and everyone thought he was finished, he was a nobody. But he applied himself and he used his grit and his strength and his intelligence. And he was able eventually to reach the pinnacle that he had sought before. He became president of the United States. Okay, there are a lot of negative things about him. A very complex personality. But here's a quote that he once said. A man's not finished when he's defeated. He's finished when he quits. Noach quit. Every one of us tonight is facing defeat and disappointment and despair about what's happening in Israel and to Jews all around the world. The entire Jewish people felt this way, that our world had been destroyed on October 7th and every day since. But please listen to this very carefully. We just started the month of November. Rachel Levi works in the birthing and delivery center at Shaarei Tzedek Hospital in Yerushalayim. It's one of the main hospitals in Jerusalem, one of the main hospitals in Israel. Listen to this. Shaarei Tzedek Hospital announced on the day that the Jewish people was involved in counting Nebuch, the number of lives lost in this terrible attack, Shaarei Tzedek Hospital announced a different number. The number was 1,823. In the month of October, perhaps the worst month for the Jewish people in how many years since the Holocaust? In the month of October 2023, in Shaarei Tzedek Hospital, there were 1,823 babies born, more than any other month in the history of that hospital. Broke all the records. And this woman, Rachel Levi, said, this is our response to Hamas. This is our hope. This is our future. The moment of defeat is the moment that led Avraham to greatness. Now, it's one of the hardest things in life to do, but it is a crucial life lesson. And if you can do this, if you can experience a terrible, tragic, God forbid, defeat, reversal, and then not quit and be able to get beyond it, if you can do this, if you can model this for your children and your grandchildren, it can be the defining feature of your greatness. Avraham, like Noach, lost. But unlike Noach, Avraham did not quit. And neither will the Jewish people. Am Yisrael Chai. The Jewish people lives. The Jewish people are eternal. The Jewish people never quits. Am Yisrael Chai. My friends, I wish you a beautiful evening and a fantastic Shabbos. I hope that we will hear good news from Israel. And remember the strengths that we as a people have. We will never quit because we are the eternal people. I look forward to seeing you all soon in person.